Okay, good evening. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad that you are joining us. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books, and very excited to have you all joining us this evening, whether you're watching this on Zoom or on Facebook Live. This is one of our final events of the 2020 year. I know that, usually when we get to the end of the year, there's some excitement about the next year, and I know with the vaccine that's been approved and people starting to get the vaccine now, there is a little bit of hope coming around the corner, I think, for a lot of us. But we're going to continue to be doing virtual events well into 2021, and so we have a great calendar of events in January and February. Most of those are currently posted on the Magic City Books website, so magiccitybooks.com. You can check out all of our upcoming events. We've got one more on Thursday night before the end of 2020 with John Densmore, who was the drummer for the band The Doors. And John has written a book, kind of partially memoir and largely a book on creativity and kind of what makes, how artists get their creativity. It's called The Seekers. And so it's an excellent book. One that we're excited about and excited to be welcoming John for an event on Thursday night. So magiccitybooks.com for more information about that. And tonight we will be joined by a former Tulsa Artists Fellow and a good friend of Magic City Books, Mark de Silva. And we are here to hear about his new book, Points of Attack. And you're going to learn a lot more about that in just a little bit. But Mark had previously worked at the New York Times on the opinion page in the Sunday magazine. He holds a PhD from Cambridge and was a Tulsa Artist Fellow for a couple of years. And so we were lucky to have him here in Tulsa a lot. We're joined tonight also by Bennett Sims, who is an author and professor at the University of Iowa. And we will be posting links to both Mark's book and Bennett's book in the chat function tonight as we go along. So check that out, and to be able to buy that book from Magic City Books, or both of those books from Magic City Books. As our co-founder likes to say, we're running a special tonight, 2 books for the price of 2. So get them both, and or get 2 of both and give 1 as a friend. So we want to thank you to Mark and Bennett for being with us tonight. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Mark and Bennett. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Bennett.
Thank you. I don't think Pat mentioned this, maybe he's mentioning it in the chat, but we do have a question and answer function. If you submit questions, I will keep an eye on them and be happy to integrate them into the conversation as we go along. So please feel free to type them in at any time. I'll try to make time for them toward the end as well. But Mark, thank you so much for asking me to be in conversation with you about this brilliant new book. It's a lot like a lot of my favorite books. It belongs to this tradition of the wide-ranging miniature philosophical essay. It ranges from clowns to terrorism to David Foster Wallace and Descartes. The essays are quite short, but quite dense. They're these bite-sized dialectical reflections on this whole host of topics. I think the best way to get a sampling of it is maybe just to hear you read one or a couple. Did you want to start with the reading?
Yeah, why don't we, I think, how about abstract structures? I think this is one that you mentioned, right?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, let me just, thank you to, first of all, thank you to Magic City Books for hosting this, I think, which has been great. And also the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, which allowed me to write this book, partly this and as well as a novel to come. And of course to you, Bennett, it's great to, I thought you might be the right audience for the book. The essays are a little unusual in the sense that they're unusually brief. So they take a little bit of wrangling, I think, on the reader's part, but hopefully it will come through. So let me just at least get the ball rolling with abstract structures. Okay. If architecture were not a form of public art, the question of whether it has become overly academic would be less pressing. Most contemporary art, after all, is deeply academic, if not always by design, then certainly in the manner it is received by audiences, long since trained to treat art as the organon of philosophy. This too is problematic, inasmuch as most of this work is hardly up to the task. But then no one demands that the public visit these galleries. If they like, they can stick to the classical collections. Architecture, being planted firmly in public space, offers no such relief, which makes its character all of our concern, not just the connoisseurs. So many interventions in public life, when they come to have an academic aspect, suffer from the problem of a little knowledge, the half-baked neurobabble we're subjected to and speaking fluently these days, with seemingly every aspect of human affairs receiving some quasi-evolutionary explanation, no matter how thin it stretches the core theory, or the economic metrics and findings we don't genuinely understand, but feel compelled to speak to anyway. How many, for instance, have a plausible claim to grasping Thomas Piketty's research and the debate it stirred within the discipline of economics over wealth inequality, a debate that is not nearly as new as we suppose. We can ask in this same spirit how ideas born in certain quarters of the academy end up getting mangled in others, say architecture departments, which in turn mangle public space. As with much recent gallery art, the appreciation of many newer buildings depends essentially on having a theoretical framework at hand to make sense of them. Without one, they can be alienating to look upon or walk through, to live in or work at. Consider all the edifices of previous generations in the so-called international style that remain for many a form of urban blight, not stemming from the usual causes of poverty or neglect, but from the indulgence of philosophical ideas over appearances. I myself worked for years in a Renzo Piano building in Manhattan that always left me cold and distanced, and this while having some sense for the deeper architectural aspirations of the age. There was, to begin with, far too much glass everywhere, glass where none was called for. Everything ran together. Months after I began working there, I asked a long tenured colleague about it and was given to understand it was all simply a matter of transparency. The thought was built right into the place. Later, I was to find him a true team player, a believer in what you might call compassionate surveillance. This notion, which I found it plausible to think the building embodied, regardless of Piano's intentions, didn't in fact raise my estimation of the building, even as it made it more intelligible. The intellectual values of clarity and directness had been turned at this site to foul ends, either by a theoretical mishandling, always possible, or less generously by design, a marshaling of philosophical talk hostile to solidity and presence that urged instead for total penetrability by sight, which might suggest a total lack of obstacles, as only a pretext for a more sinister labor disciplining intention. The tower also had curious meshes floating above each of its faces. So whenever you looked at it from the street, you felt as if you were only half seeing it, the way one does the entrance to a house through a screen door. There were green reasons for these screens. I could see this without being told or even grasping exactly what they did. This is how theory is lost in reception without actually getting out of the way. Since most recent showpiece constructions of note had not opted for these unsightly shields that seem to have been added on like over-egged accessories, I could only assume there were ways of achieving environmentally sound results that didn't require them. Probably there was a tortuous aesthetic justification for the veil, something I expect about frustrating the urban gaze, never mind all the glass within. More recently, I've heard the building referred to as lesser Piano. I understand this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'd requested that one because it was one of my personal favorites from the book. Reading these, as I said, I was reminded of a lot of my favorite books, like Adorno's Minima Moralia or Barth's Mythologies. And so I guess one question to start with is just how you approach the writing of these short essays, when you began working on them, when you conceived of them as a book, and what other books you had in mind or in conversation with as you were working on these.
I think the original entry point was partly editorial. I mean, working at the New York Times for many years, actually, and then working at various magazines, I was coming across a lot of opinion pieces, for instance, across a lot of topics written by various experts in various fields, and having to handle them either as an editor or a fact checker or whatnot. So the issues were I was constantly fed these sort of topics as sort of food for thought. And so in a way they inspired my own work in a sort of indirect way. I would edit these pieces and have sort of a remainder of sort of substance of my own and my own thinking upon, say, the issue that happened to be dealt with that week or that day. So I think that was part of the origins of the vast majority of essays. There's one here, which I'll read later, that was actually written for a fellowship that for a sort of a fellowship within a fellowship when I was in Tulsa at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. And that was the sort of think tank on issues of memory. And so that was the origin of one essay. So I wrote that. But I kind of liked, I think maybe from working in op-ed, I was thinking, hey, okay, these are 800 words. What if I went for 400 words? What if I went for even greater compression and distillation? And maybe the people I was thinking of in terms of that have been influential to me are people like Francis Bacon in particular. Like Montaigne's essays, for instance, who are obviously influenced Bacon, are quite long, quite extended. They have a lot of fat to them. You know, there's a lot of, you know, meandering. They go many places. They're very interesting. Bacon's ones, for whatever reason, are very, very compressed. Maybe it was the scientist in him that drove him towards this sort of very tight, very compressed forms. I think even Bart or Benjamin, they're also a little bit longer. It's an unusual length. Most of these are 300 to 500 words. I think the best example of a recent writer writing in something this form would maybe be John Berger, and some of his stuff with ways of seeing and portraits, and mostly concentrated on visual arts, whereas mine sort of are, as you say, are sort of all over the place in terms of topics. But I would say formally, maybe he's the guy that has something most to do with that stuff, as well as maybe analytic philosophy more generally. They're tight, compressed forms that I've sort of drawn on in various ways.
In terms of the breadth of topics, you write in the preface about themes emerging, and you're sort of curating after the fact groupings of these essays to juxtapose them with one another. And I was curious about that process too. Like if you were writing essays toward themes at a certain point, if you see essays in conversation with one another across the section dividers, yeah, how did you think about the larger architecture of this book?
I think as I started to realize that I had, you know, 20, 30, 40 of these pieces on my hand. I mean, there was always the question, do I want to develop these in a more conventional direction, just make them full-fledged sort of mini sort of position papers on these various issues? But I got the sense after, you know, maybe 20 or 30, that was what was most interesting to me about them was both the concision, what they demanded of the reader, that the reader has to do like at least half the work of these pieces in a way where say at the times in an op-ed, we wouldn't allow that. Like we would want to give the meat of the thing so the reader can go home with a takeaway and be like, here's what I ought to think about X issue because such and such expert has written convincingly about it. Here, I think only half of the work maybe is done, half of the labor, and much of it is left for the reader. I think in the way I was thinking of them, there is an element of accumulation, I think, to the pieces that I do think that they don't, the summary of this book is not the summary of 90 pieces. I think there's roughly about 90. That, I don't know if that would, any of the early readers would say that that's really the essence of this book. It's something more like a sensibility, currents that run through pieces, sections, the same example may be revisited from another direction in a later piece. I haven't really tried to make them parts of a systematic theory or things that you could sort of, you know, concatenate in a sort of intellectual. It is meant to be sort of more of a bubbling up of maybe a sensibility, even where, you know, you could say, hey, these two essays are actually making, you know, points that are, you know, at loggerheads in some way. You know, I didn't try to iron that out because it was maybe the sensibility that was most interesting to me. What happens when you ask questions this way? I think partly it can lead you to realize how difficult it is to give yourself a picture that's both honest and accurate to the data and also coherent and unified in certain ways.
Yeah, I'm interested that you talk about the sensibility of the book and the internal contradictions across essays, because one of the things I was really interested in as I was reading it was this question of persona. Like most of the essays are written in the first person plural, this like collective we. occasionally, like in the piece you just read, you'll make this move where you downshift into a more autobiographical I. Like the essay begins with a we. We's are considerations about architecture, and then you tell this very funny anecdote about you personally working in what I'm assuming is the New York Times building. And yeah, some even are written in the second person. There's a piece on dementia that's addressed to the reader, like you might fear death more than dementia or vice versa. And I was really interested in how you were mediating the movement between your individual self and this like collective persona who's narrating most of these pieces, who the we is when the we is speaking, whether you ever found yourself arguing points as the we or opening up points of attack as the we that you, Mark, were surprised by or wouldn't necessarily co-sign.
Right, I think that's absolutely true. I don't know if I would have put it quite that way to myself till now, but that seems right to me. That there are points where I am thinking. I think, and this is probably an inheritance of analytic philosophy, partly because part of the mission of that particular brand of philosophy is to take the temperature of some of our collective intuitions, as it were. We're speaking from a we rather than from our idiosyncrasies, which we differ from the collective, where our personal sense differs from common sense. Much of the field is dedicated, I think this is the inheritance that I'm quite interested in. Much of it is dedicated to where's the overlap too? Where are our intuitions aligned? And so sometimes, as you say, I would be speaking not really from my personal intuitions, which frequently can be quite, at odds or deviant from the sort of the general sort of framework of where are our intuitions as a culture. So there's a we that I think is sometimes speaking towards my sort of taking the measure of where do I feel like, what are the thoughts we find compelling, we find intuitively plausible, as an analytic philosopher would say. And then sometimes the I interjections are meant to be sort of like where maybe that common sense doesn't quite, add up or doesn't quite square, and to raise questions within the pieces, sometimes by shifting within the essays between the first and second person, or third and first, and these sorts of variations. So I think that might be part of what's going on with the we that you say is quite, it's probably the dominant note. That must, I won't say I planned, to make it that way, but I take it that it's an inheritance of practicing philosophy in a certain way, in terms of the sort of anthropological I the field often operates. Let's say Wittgenstein classically, or Quine, or many of the Bertrand Russell. The idea was to capture our intuitions, not merely my idiosyncratic intuition. So I think I start there oftentimes, but sometimes I get somewhere else, or else I'll start personally and then broaden out towards where maybe we all are, and how does that square?
Yeah, one of the things I really like about the shift to the I and that piece in particular is how it's also a shift in genre. So the piece begins as a conceptual or theoretical critique of architecture's relationship to theory. Like, the problem with contemporary architecture for this narrator is that it can't reconcile ideas and appearance or theory and form. And then you downshift into this narrative anecdote of you being baffled by like the bad design decisions of this crappy office building you're forced to work in. And the narrative, in a funny way, ends up dramatizing your critique of architecture. So the concepts that we saw outlined at the first half of the essay then become narrativized in the second half of the essay. And in a funny way, the essay ends up enacting the very synthesis of idea and appearance or theory and form that you critique architecture for failing to pull off. Like, because we know what your critique of architecture is, we can appreciate this narrative. Right. And there's a line later in the book in your essay on parables where you say what's interesting about parables is that it's thinking via story versus thinking via theory. And since you are a novelist who's written like a very essayistic philosophical novel of ideas that ranges from like cloud physics to political theory and music theory, and you're also a formally trained philosopher working in the essay tradition, in this book, reading the abstract structures piece, I was curious what your relationship to these two kinds of thinking are, like thinking in story versus thinking in theory. What it feels like for you to make that genre shift in that piece or throughout the book from.
Right. I think sort of theoretical kind of thinking I've been involved with a very long time, since being an undergraduate, since even maybe my high school days. I was thinking, well, philosophy seems to fit in a certain way very well with me. And so some of the early stuff I read was certainly very theoretical, like the Kantian stuff and that sort of stuff. And I think maybe only later I started to realize that there are ways in which the individual anecdote or the story or what seems to be accidental is sort of often the source or the material against which we test the theory. And so later you realize that the theory is very much beholden to the individual incident, the particular, as it were, as opposed to the general. So I have deep tendencies towards the theoretical. Yes, that's very clear. I think for this book and for my previous books and probably from anything I'll ever write, I assume. But you're right that I'm concerned that maybe theory in itself can't finish the job, that there's a place for the sort of the bottomless pit that's a story, or that's an incident, let's even say, even before the story it's been narrated, right? It's an event, it's an occurrence, and we try to grapple and make sense. And frequently those are, those are the stimulus for a theory. I mean, even for instance, to take a very easy example, Trump's election in 2016 was an event. It wasn't a happening. Mm. It has led to this need to say, what is it that just happened here? How has this happened? How is this even possible? So, as it were, the need for theory arises pretty organically. It's because very strange stuff occurs in life, like his election, for instance, which shocked many people with my sort of background or my kind of inheritance of certain things. What was quite surprising and feels the need. So in the same way that the grit of sand is sort of the stimulus to the construction of the pearl by the oyster. There's something like that to event. It is the source of the stimulus of our grand ideas. So it shouldn't be given the kind of short shrift maybe a theoretician is inclined to give it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, and I should say that you do touch on contemporary politics and Trump's election throughout the book. I was curious to hear when earlier you were talking about like pieces that surprised you or that contradicted one another, if you had particular ones in mind. And I'd also be curious to hear more if you had some queued up that you wanted to read.
I don't know that off the top. I noticed certain tensions in going through the edits that even the various editors would say, would point things out and be like, yeah, let's leave that. Let's not iron that. There are tensions even within the piece. For instance, I have these pieces on for instance, the ones on sports, which are quite critical in many ways of maybe sports spectatorship, etc. But then perhaps from the book itself, but also certainly from the book that's coming, which is probably 400 of the pages are based on sports. Around, obviously, I've been a spectator in a major way. So it's like, in that case, it's almost an internal critique. It's like, I'm clearly very committed to watching this, to participating in this certain way. But it's difficult for me to find a way of reconciling it, as it were, with certain philosophical ideas. So where does that leave us? You could keep the practice and dump the theory. You could keep the theory and change your practice. Or there might be a way of you carry on with a certain behavior that you cannot necessarily reflectively endorse entirely. I think that's frequently the position of actual life, which is again where I think maybe theory sometimes gets things wrong. It's like that's a nice position, but is it a livable position? Is it one we can work ourselves into? And so I would say, just off the top, the sports one, because it occurred to me that they're quite critical in a certain way of maybe the ethics of contact sports in particular. I discuss, right? The CTE, the causes of these things, but yet we find them compelling. We find that kind of frankly, that kind of violence, compelling in a certain way. And I think a lot of people, frankly, a lot of intellectuals even do, which I also mentioned in one of the pieces. So those are the kind of tensions that I didn't want to try to say, well, now that you're saying it doesn't seem like it's such a good idea, or that these people don't seem to have enough agency to really endorse and sign off, should I now withdraw the fact that, I do take a sort of personal interest or relish in these things? So that might be one example, maybe not the best, but one.
Yeah, that essay interested me because there were a few moments when essays seemed to be in conversation with one another, even if they were in separate sections, and dozens of pages apart. There were just these like ligatures that were across the book. And the essay on like the ethics of spectatorship in sports and the degree to which the choice to participate in like a traumatic occupation is freely chosen reminded me a lot of your piece on warfare and soldiers enlisting. And it felt as if you were, interrogating both questions on sort of similar paths, and that the essays were companion pieces in a way. I'm curious if you thought of them that way, or thought of any of the essays in the book this way.
I mean, you raised an example, and I'll say frankly, that's not something that I considered or constructed. That the sense is to me is that these are 90 pieces that are really one mind working its way through a linked cluster of problems. So that's a great instance, right? Warfare, exactly the choice, the autonomy that's involved in signing up for a career, say a military career, versus the options available to such a person. Then we take to contact sports, say boxing, I have football, et cetera. And some of the same moral issues surface in different ways. And I seem to take, my attitude seems to maybe vary slightly depending on the context. The substance of it seems to be like, well, if the autonomy is the case, then shouldn't maybe you share a response to both? But I don't know that intuitively that, I don't know if that's actually true, that intuitively I do. But I mean, I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because those are the kinds of things that I think are most interesting about the pieces, rather than these sort of self-standing things. We have plenty of sort of self-standing essays on many issues. But it is the weave, I think, that, hey, we're looking at the same issue, but now we seem to be saying, this is the unattractive side of that issue, or this is the side that makes a disruption for what seems to be a nice argument on the other side. So I don't know how much I consciously attended to all of those issues, but in the rewriting, I realized that I don't want to sort of pasteurize the whole thing and make it, sort of sterile and clean and good in that way. I'd rather keep some of the sense of a live mind and activity, which is, I think, partly a mind that I think that's a commonplace. We understand that the mind is always in a certain amount of tension with itself, even when it's functioning well. Like even at its height, it's not really, the ideal mind is not necessarily this kind of like purely logical or rationalistic one that's actually alive to the world, that's responsive to lived circumstances as they're occurring. So this is the anti-theoretical strain maybe of the book, is that they won't necessarily square in that nice way. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there's another way of thinking. Maybe we can reconcile certain problems one by one and sort of do a sort of running job of repair, rather than thinking what we need is a theory where everything slots into place in a certain way, which of course from my training was the emphasis, was that sort of theory. And maybe that's where I've pulled away in my interest in literature and stories, partly in the stories that maybe don't quite add up, but are still so revelatory of what's actually going on.
Cool. Yeah, that's fascinating. We've touched on a lot of the essays, just talking about them, but I would be curious to hear another one if you have one.
Yeah. Which one did you have in mind? I know you gave me a couple to think about. So.
You referenced one earlier that you wanted to read, that you had applied for the fellowship within the fellowship.
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay. This is, right, past resistance. Okay. Here are a few platitudes about memory. It's subjective, it's plastic, it's often self-servingly selective when it's not simply fiction. Naturally, autobiography, by which I mean that recounting of a human life in which protagonist and author are one, can't help but inherit these liabilities. They once would have counted as such anyway, in many quarters in humanities departments for some time now, and more recently and troublingly in American politics and popular culture. Acknowledging the frailty of memory and narrative history, whether personal or collective, seems to have brought with it a kind of relief from the age-old demands for objectivity, or even intersubjectivity. In many spheres, and especially online, we are now asked to admit to the looseness of memory's grip and the tallness of every tale. It's what authenticity and honesty require, we're told, a frank reckoning with human finitude. But the news isn't all bad, or is it? For we are also invited to celebrate a newfound power over our pasts and our presents too, through a curious form of autonomy that would have come as a surprise to Kant. Freedom from the tyranny of fact. Subjectivity, partiality, the fragment, and the shard have all become refuges from the fraught project of assembling wholes. As a novelist, I have watched closely and with some dismay as this phenomenon has manifested in literary circles. Mainstream critics and readers appear besotted by a shrunken, self-pitying strain of diary fiction. You could call it with some fairness Facebook fiction, to distinguish it from more formidable versions of the past. Say Jacques Roubaud's The Great Fire of London, the first book in a notoriously strenuous 6-volume cycle of memoirs. Novels by Jeff Dyer, Sheila Heti, Ben Lerner, and Carl Uwe Knausgaard, whose own memoir cycle, My Struggle, might be usefully compared to Roubaud's, if only to measure the diminution in ambition, seem premised on the notion that if it is our fate to embroider and even fabricate our past, insulating our preferred identities from the sharp edges of actuality, we ought to openly acknowledge our fraudulence and fantasize with purpose, even panache. The White House has taken note. For my part, I've never found this particular conscription of the imagination, whether in literature, electoral politics, or daily life, especially appealing. Some liberties aren't worth taking. Reading these authors, one feels that if they had more conviction, they would exercise their imaginations fully in the invention of characters, plots, and settings without simply lifting them from their own lives. Or else they would get down to the painstaking work of research and corroboration that's involved in any plausible, or authentic, if you like, history, including autobiography. Instead, they seem to have settled on a middling path, both creatively, why struggle to invent from whole cloth when you can just use your life, your memories to fill in your novel, and intellectually, why sift and weigh the facts when you can just make up what suits the tale you'd like to tell, the person you'd like to be, whenever reality doesn't oblige. The deepest difficulty attending the autobiographical self is the one that afflicts art generally, sentimentality. Nostalgia, its most obvious form, is hardly the end of it, for the tint of the glasses needn't be rose. The red of self-lacerating shame or righteous indignation will do just as well, as will the gray of ironic ennui. Do just as well for what, though? Evasion, frequently of oneself. This is what binds the various forms of sentimentality together. The desire to feel a certain way about oneself or the world overrides the desire to know the truth about it. Fantasy comes first. Yes, memory is malleable and subject to all sorts of failings. No one can seriously deny this, and no one should want to. But why treat these banal faults as insuperable, a limiting horizon of our humanness? When it comes to personal testimony, we nearly always have some form of corroborating evidence. Written records, videotape, artifacts of various sorts, and of course, other people's memories, against which we can check our recollections, supposing we're genuinely interested in the truth. Now, the significance of events may be impossible to settle definitively, no matter how much checking and rechecking we do. But this fault cannot be accounted a failure of memory or narrative. It's simply a consequence of events almost always being able to bear multiple interpretations. That lends no credence to the more extreme claims we now hear, for instance, that all narrative or memoir is really fiction. This claim is of just the same order as the one that all news is really fake, even if the people making these two assertions tend to belong to different political parties. Rather than any intrinsic limitation on the faculty of memory or the practice of storytelling, it is sentimentality, ginned up outrage at political goings-on that barely touch our lives, say, or tender melancholia about America and how it used to be, that stands in the way of good autobiography, good politics, and good fiction. That sounds like something we can work on, though, if not exactly master. Nothing like fate.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, this essay really interested me. It's the last essay in the book. It's one of the ones that's written most forcefully from first person. Like as a novelist, here's what I think about autofiction and these trends in politics. And you had mentioned earlier that the circumstances in which you wrote it were a little different. Like you were using it, you wrote it, the occasion for writing it was to apply for a fellowship. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear just about that. Like what led you to this piece?
It was actually not part of the application, but it was part of the task, which was essentially to draw on the research that we were conducting in that seminar. It was the topic of memory. And so my sort of research in the seminar I had led in particular, my particular session was on memory and the narrative self. So this was sort of the essay that sprung out of that. We each sort of took a crack at it, or maybe 12 members, and we each took a crack at that, developing something, research as it were, based on the seminar. And so that was after presenting and after towards the end of that term. These are the sort of thoughts occurred to me, and clearly they're influenced by the other pieces I was putting together. I was thinking, well, this looks like an occasion for that ongoing sort of project that had been taking shape anyway. And it's a little longer, that's true. It's a little bit more extended and developed, a little bit more pointed. But, you know, I think it still draws in some of the same feeling of not necessarily trying to be the final word on anything. You know, it's not trying to be comprehensive, but trying to focus the mind in a certain way on a certain set of potential insights or an angle of attack, you know, an approach to the question. So they grew out of essentially concerns about narrativity, about the self, about sentimentality, and about truth. And what's the relationship between self and truth, and what are the ideas that seem to be common currency nowadays that are floated, which seem to be inherited from sort of postmodern traditions, right? But now are quite, you know, in ascendance on both sides of the political aisle in terms of the sort of fantasizing that goes on in a quite open way for sort of a disregard for their being a sort of intersubjective measuring point. And so I think the essay maybe takes as its point that there's an odd linkage between these types of fantasies and a detachment from facing up to maybe facts that make the story less fun or less interesting in some way, but maybe have a little bit more of a tether to actually what's going on around us. So.
Yeah, we actually have a question in the chat that sort of bears on this point from Kara. Any realizations you've had by writing nonfiction? Any tropes or fads you wanted to avoid?
Okay. Well, I mean, one thing is I definitely didn't want to construct a classic sort of essay collection of, you know, 5,000 word pieces, 4,000 word pieces. There are no like reviews in here. I definitely didn't want it to be a, you know, collection can sometimes mean, you know, a rag bag of various pieces written for, you know, all sorts of different occasions. I wanted it to, in a way, be a thing that still has unity, that ought to be considered as a whole. So in some ways, I wasn't really writing the traditional collection per se, which is actually a gathering of, you know, materials that say one is published in various venues. It's like a set of discrete pieces that's meant to be read together. It's almost an instruction towards the reader, as it were. Here's a bunch of different things, but they really ought to be read at once, as opposed to here's things that came out at 12 venues, and I've done you the favor. You might have already read them in those venues, but I've gathered them, and you can read them in any which way you like. I think there's something essential about the unity of these pieces within covers in some way. That would defeat some of their purposes. So in a way, I don't really have a body of nonfiction to speak of besides this. I mean, I'm not really an essayist. I've written maybe, I guess, 1 or 2 essays, and it's just not an area that I really delve into. So this was sort of, I felt pretty early on within the first 1/3 of the pieces coming together that this was a unified project. And that's why I put it forth this way. It also makes its reception a little bit complicated. It's difficult to excerpt. It's difficult to make sense of individually. It's those threads and currents that are really the meat of the work, the sensibility, as it were.
We've got a question from Dustin about the topics you chose. Were there any issues you started to write about and backed away from, or any you wished you had included?
Well, let's see. I think here's another thing where I basically gave myself carte blanche to, there were certainly areas where I would be thinking maybe it would help, promote the unity of this work in some ways, or a certain type of unity, if I didn't include stuff on, take sports, for instance. That seems kind of like, given that so much about heavy issues like literature and politics and all these other things, I've also not really tried to shed things that I thought maybe are a little bit smaller in scope, or maybe my angle on them anyway. I have a piece on esports, for instance, which I could have easily said, well, maybe this isn't up to the seriousness of the treatment I want. Most of the book was avoiding a certain type of censorship that I thought might have been distorting to the intent here, and maybe pushing against a certain type of curation, because I sort of thought the point of this particular work was the sensibility more than anything, and rather than any sort of, this is a meditation on X. I sort of think you could say this is a meditation. I wouldn't even know what to call this a meditation. It's the mind on display is almost more significant than any specific issue, though it can't really get to work or show you what it's up to until it has a topic to work with, as it were. So the topics are almost an accessory to show the mind and its workings, rather than I have things to say about this issue or that issue. It's more an opportunity to display a way of thinking, a way of following a line of thought, a way of working one's way through the world rather than any particular issue. So I would say, in a way, I made an effort not to be too specific on those, because I wanted the mentality to shine through and say, hey, even when you're talking about something relatively light or small, it could be the same mind that's going to work on terrorism or something very heavy. And somehow these are linked in a certain way that is not thematic, as it were, in an orbital sense, but almost formal or subjective in terms of the mind producing it.
Yeah, one of the things that interested me about the piece you just read was its like really provocative critique of autofiction and this sort of hunger for authenticity effect in literary culture that is concomitant with this suspicion of media authorities, like fake news. And so you read these two currents in parallel to one another, and you trace them back toward this suspiciousness toward memory in general. And I was curious, memory and subjectivity in general, I was curious what like a good autofiction would look like for you, or what features of it can sort of reconcile these problems in a way that is sort of aesthetically interesting and satisfying for you. I say this as like a fan of most of the authors cited in that essay, and I say this. Sorry, and I say this also as like thinking of your abstract structures piece as like working as a piece of miniature autofiction. Like I get a lot of the same pleasures from that piece that I do from autofiction.
This is a question I would almost turn back towards you, Bennett, because if you're someone who is engaged in finding examples that speak to you, then in a way that's almost the way to proceed. I don't think I have a kind of ideological opposition to the very idea of it. I think in one way, I think, yes, using your own experience and memories is stock and trade of writers from the beginning of time. In a way, the rebranding, in a way, for sort of various purposes. They could be personal, political, and obviously commercial, of a sort of galvanizing of a sense of a movement through the 2010s, say, and maybe springing from things like reality hunger, David Shields, right? Writing a little bit before that, sort of setting the tone that it's obvious people have a desperate hunger for, right? This idea of some kind of grounding in a world much like Baudrillard described. I think that's the context, right? That yes, obviously we feel very much in a hall of mirrors. So there's this search and there's this sense that what can I offer at this point that speaks with any authority except testimony? Like, here's what I thought I saw, or here's what I thought I experienced. It's a kind of, I don't see it as unnatural at all. It makes perfect sense in a society that feels more and more virtual, more and more unmoored. The only thing left, as it were, the last little fragment may be testimony, right? But in a way that overplays the extent to which one has a very good grip on one's own experience or one's own mind, right? And I think analytic philosophers have been pursuing that vein for some time. And Wittgenstein himself says, about private languages, that these things are really not self-sustaining. Your testimony, you may feel especially privileged and important. It might be very important to you, but it doesn't have any special relationship with any broader authority per se. So in a way, you might as well talk about the world, because you're not in a special safe zone when you talk about yourself. Like, oh, here I know what I'm talking about, but I don't know what I'm talking about when I'm talking out there. It's often a kind of epistemic retreat. I think the value of certain analytic thinkers, and continental ones as well, is that there is no special zone of self-knowledge either. So one consequence of that is feel free to weigh in on reality, because it's your grip on that is as tenuous as your grip on your own mind and your own feelings. If you feel you need to restrict yourself to testimony about your own mind, you might as well testify more broadly about, your experience throughout the world. There's no special divide there where you can feel safe, as it were. So I'm quite open to works. I think I mentioned Jacques Roubaud in the essay, right? I mean, his one is also based on a point of grief, right? His wife dying. So that book seems to me, in many respects, it has some of the founding principles of the books that are written more recently. Many are or can be grief-based in some way. Knausgaard's are in certain ways. Some of the other authors are grief or a lost authenticity, maybe a certain sort of society. But I sort of think selling your own epistemic infirmity is maybe not such a unique or grand achievement. It would be more interesting to me, books like Roubaud's, where he still tries to venture something as a mathematician, as someone who knows. He says, what do I do with these pieces? I've been pushed back upon my subjectivity by the death of my wife in that case, whereas maybe we have been pushed back by the death of reality. So it's maybe a little different, but in the same sense, there's a grieving, right? We don't have this, but what I have left are these fragments, say, but it seems to me that, there's plenty to do with those fragments that needn't be as much of a retreat. And I sometimes feel like there's a diminution, a kind of haplessness to many of the narrators. And I think one thing about the narrator of this book, right, Points of Attack, I don't think hapless would be the word. Full of doubts, questions, worries, certainly fully acknowledging the epistemic difficulties, but without a sense of, oh my God, I'm folding in on myself. Without the sense that he's not up to the task of living or reality, where I feel there's that sense of shrinkage to much of recent fiction, a kind of retreat. And I think you could address many of those same facts in a more assertive or forceful kind of way, without losing anything. So maybe those are my governing thoughts. But on this issue, actually, I'm quite curious what you say. Many of these authors speak to you in some way. Tell me what you think. What is it that they do specially say that maybe is distinctive of this particular moment, that's different from other work that was grounded in the eye?
I think that autofiction as a marketing category or a trend maybe isn't especially distinct. I think of a lot of these authors as working out of Sebald, who's working out of Bernhard, who's working out of, this tradition of the novel going back through Proust to, all the way to the beginning of first person writing. And so I think of them as novels of consciousness more than all, when I'm describing them to myself as I'm reading them, more than I think of them as works of autofiction or diary fiction. And the authenticity fictions in them, because often the reality effects are quite playfully fabricated, including like Sebald's foxed fake photographs, fictional characters and things. That sort of shimmer interests me less than just the movement of the mind on the page. And one of the things that I think the books sort of do beautifully is like reclaim space in the novel for it to be an essayistic medium, like for it to just be a repository of movements of mind and like a kind of congealed block of consciousness, where the narrators are letting you know what they're thinking about the books and movies and artworks they're seeing, along with whatever the drama of the novel is. This is like mostly what I read novels for. And one of my favorite novelists, Nicholson Baker, is not typically considered an author of autofiction, but his works provide essentially the same pleasures. That's a lot of the pleasure from your book for me is, as you were saying, is seeing a mind in motion, seeing a mind that is thinking in theory and in narrative, or thinking in theory and in story, and just, yeah, isolating moments or movements of that mind, and sculpting forms for them. I don't know, if you have a response, I'd be curious. We also have a question in the chat that sort of touches on these considerations of genre. So yeah, Chris asks, and this is a longer question with a quotation in the middle. In his book, Straw Dogs, the political philosopher John Gray ends a discussion of the anti-ethical strand in Western philosophy, represented by Machiavelli, Hobbes, Mandeville, and Nietzsche, with the assertion, moral philosophy is very largely a branch of fiction. Despite this, a philosopher has yet to write a great novel. The fact should not be surprising. In philosophy, the truth about human life is of no interest. Setting aside some obvious counterexamples, Murdoch, Sartre, Gass, how does this statement strike you as someone with connections to both disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that. The instinct to do philosophy, traditionally anyway, is a kind of it's a kind of push towards ideality, a push towards unity of a certain sort of linkage and a certain kind of perfection. I mean, you could also put another maybe more routine way of putting that is towards a certain type of utopianism, right? That ideas fit together in a certain way, and our practice ought to fit together in a certain way, say morals. So I can see there's something about that the best way you get a very tight, clean theory is to neglect a lot of the actual details of life, which is sort of the bread and butter of I won't say all novels. I mean, novels, when we take extended prose, right? Maybe not the term novel in particular, applying to the stuff that Ian Watt talked about, you know, the kind of birth of the English novel, is very much grounded in a type of documentary realism, in details that don't necessarily mesh, in episodic forms of development that maybe are not as connected to justifying ideas or proving ideas in the way that, say, classical poetry often is, right? That's a counterposed kind of form. And the romance, of course, was also a form that didn't mind thinking that, you know, narrative could be learned, narrative could have didactic points, philosophical points, etc. I think the novel proper, right, in the more narrow sense we now use it, is for this fundamentally anti-theoretical kind of form in some ways. I myself connect myself more broadly to the broader prose tradition. We don't have a good word for it, right? That encompasses both romance and the novel, as it were, and also just the philosophical treatise of, whether it's Plato working in dialogue form or a consolation of philosophy later on, these sorts of things. I see myself as working in prose forms, but maybe not necessarily with the commitment of the novelist per se to fragmentation, to brokenness, to the everyday. Also, that's another thing that's frequently emphasized by, novelists can't make very good, or philosophers can't make very good novels because they're maybe not they're not thinking about the everyday. They don't want to dignify it in the right way. But you think more broadly about prose traditions, whether that's, or even poetic traditions, like Dante, say, right? That has a lot of philosophical content. Or you take, certain other types of authors, even allegorical authors can have their own. See, Pilgrim's Progress, Pierce Plowman. There are ways in which philosophy can sort of play a role in all of these things. But I think there's the narrow idea of the novel that maybe doesn't have much room for philosophy, but there's a larger one that says, well, we can be up to didactic things. We could, Robert Musil say, right, is doing all kinds of things about social analysis in The Man Without Qualities. And oftentimes it seems to be removed from certain concrete moral problems because he seems to be more interested in ideas. So I think one can go in either way, and there isn't necessarily a novel. Philosophers should get out of this business, or they're the best ones at it, or it's sort of more a piecemeal idea. I think of myself as an extended prose writer, right? That's free to pull on my imagination as much as on daily life or fact or theoretical truth.
Yeah, you have this lovely line in one of your essays about the resistance of art to paraphrase. You say we don't come to novels or poems for their arguments. That's why it doesn't make sense to paraphrase one. And maybe the best thing we can do is simply attend to them. And I thought that was beautifully put and sort of served as an ars poetica for this book as well. Like there's a sense in which these are lines of thought, these are arguments that could be paraphrased, but as you pointed out, like there's so much movement and contradiction and turbulence and the sensibility and the mind at work that you really do need to attend to them as you would a person. We have one last question in the chat maybe, if we're coming up on 8, and this is from Haidang. And he says, what are the remainders, your word, or residues of points of attack and logos? What did they leave behind to be taken up next for you?
That's interesting. It's nice to hear from Haidong as well. I hope you're doing well. Where I'm headed next, I'm thinking of, I mean, the Logos is this very, it's a very long novel. It's it's one of these sort of 1,000-page bricks. So that's been in development for a while, and it deals with theater and acting and movies and sports are the basic big themes of it. And it is sort of diagnostic vis-a-vis the culture at large. It's my sort of zeitgeist novel, I suppose, in a certain way, but it's done in a particular way. It's all done in the first person, frankly. So it maybe draws on some of the these features of autofiction, at least structurally. But next, I think what I'm thinking of is something that actually tries to go back to philosophy in a deep way, tries to explore Descartes, tries to explore some of the founding very structures of subjectivity. How does subjectivity get on the map, whether you're a Cartesian or someone very anti-Cartesian like Heidegger or Hegel? They both want to deal with the birth of subjectivity in some way, the birth of a mind, the kind of mind that can produce a book or be represented in a book, or that's represented in an autofiction, right? That display of selfhood. I think the next work I want to work on is the formation of selfhood in a quite systematic way. So I'm still puzzling out what that's going to be like, because I think there are tensions there. I mean, the idea of a sort of Cartesian self is this sort of slightly removed, purely cogitative one, but the way I'm addressing it is more, well, yeah, that's certainly a dimension, but there's also the social formation. So I want to deal with maybe a total canvas of the formation of a mind, which is partly a formation of a society, I think. So I would say that's the remainder from this book. This book, I think, does a fair enough job of expressing a mind, but I'd like to get into discussing mindedness full stop, as it were. What is it to come into a mind, as it were? And I don't know, this book doesn't necessarily address that, but that might be where I'm headed. So
cool. Yeah, we are just at 8. So unless there are any final questions, that might be as good a place as any to end it.
Talking with you, Bennett, about these issues. It's been lovely to hear your takes too. I mean, we haven't been in touch recently, so it is kind of nice to also just reacquaint myself with you and you know, your work as well. I'm excited to see what's coming next with what you're working on. And do you have a certain thing that you're working on now that?
Yeah, if you're gonna, I'm rubber and you're glue, and bounce your final question off of you and onto me, and I will. Yeah, I've been working on stories. I've been plugging away. Have stories coming out. Would like to finish a collection, and I'm also working on longer project. So, yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you about this book. I loved it.
Thank you for troubling with the work. I know, you know, there's a certain amount of work goes into these, you know, doing these events, coming to grips with that. So I appreciate it. I felt like you were the right one to go through this with me, and I think that's been borne out sort of. So
yeah, thank you. This is really lovely. Well, everyone, please order your copies of Points of Attack from Magic City Books, and stay safe this winter. And hopefully we will all be going to your Logos reading in person.